November 1942. The Eastern Front, somewhere above the frozen hell of Stalingrad. A 19-year-old German pilot named Erich Hartmann is about to make a mistake that should kill him. He is flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's premier fighter aircraft, hunting for Soviet aircraft over a battlefield that has become the graveyard of entire armies. Below him, hundreds of thousands of men are dying in the ruins of a city that bears Stalin's name. The frozen Volga River is choked with the bodies of soldiers who tried to cross it. The temperature is 30 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze a man's flesh in minutes, cold enough to turn motor oil into sludge and make metal brittle as glass. Hartmann has been in combat for only a few weeks. He has completed his training, earned his wings, been assigned to Jagdgeschwader 52, one of the most successful fighter groups in the entire Luftwaffe. But he has not yet killed anyone. He has not yet proven himself. He is, in the harsh calculus of aerial combat, nothing more than a liability to his squadron until he learns how to fight and survive. Today, he spots a Soviet aircraft below him, an Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, the heavily armored ground attack plane that German soldiers on the ground have learned to fear and hate. The Il-2 is hunting German positions, its cannons and bombs ready to turn men into corpses. If Hartmann can shoot it down, he will have his first kill. He will have proven himself worthy of the wings he wears. He pushes the stick forward and dives. This is his first mistake. He is too eager, too aggressive, too focused on his target to remember what his instructors taught him during the long months of training. He closes the distance too quickly, approaching at an angle that gives him a clear shot, but also makes him completely predictable. He is thinking like an excited hunter who has spotted his prey, not like a fighter pilot who wants to survive the encounter. The Soviet pilot sees him coming. The Il-2 Sturmovik was designed with a rear gunner specifically to deal with threats like this. German fighters diving from above, eager for an easy kill. The rear gunner swings his weapon around and opens fire, and suddenly Hartmann's cockpit is filled with the terrifying sound of bullets striking metal. His engine coughs, sputters, begins trailing thick black smoke. Oil sprays across his windscreen, blinding him almost completely. The controls go sluggish and unresponsive in his hands. Warning lights flash across the instrument panel, lights that tell him his aircraft is dying, that he has only seconds to make a decision that will determine whether he lives or dies. He has made every mistake a rookie pilot can make, and now he is going to pay the price for his inexperience and his eagerness. The Messerschmitt falls out of the sky, trailing fire and smoke, spinning toward the frozen earth below. Hartmann fights the controls desperately, trying to recover some semblance of control, but the aircraft is dying around him. The engine has seized, the hydraulics are failing, and the ground is rushing up at a speed that makes thought almost impossible. He has only seconds to make a decision. Stay with the plane and try to crash land on the frozen Russian steppe, or bail out over enemy territory, and take his chances on the ground with Soviet soldiers who have every reason to kill a German pilot on sight. He bails out. The parachute opens with a sharp jolt that nearly knocks the breath from his lungs, and he drifts down toward the Russian lines, toward capture, toward a war that he has barely begun to fight. Below him, Soviet soldiers are already pointing upward at the white canopy descending from the sky, already moving to intercept the German pilot who has fallen directly into their midst. This is how Erich Hartmann's combat career begins, with failure, with humiliation, with a crashed aircraft and a long, desperate walk back to German lines after he somehow manages to evade capture by pretending to be wounded, and then escaping when his captors are distracted. It is an inauspicious start for a pilot who will go on to achieve something that no one else in the entire history of aerial combat has ever matched, something that no one will likely ever match again. By the time the war ends, Erich Hartmann will have shot down 352 enemy aircraft, more than any other pilot in history, more than the next two highest-scoring aces combined, more than entire fighter squadrons achieved during the course of the war. He will fly over 1,400 combat missions, engage in more than 800 individual dogfights, and be shot down himself 16 times. He will never lose a wingman in combat, not once in more than 2 years of continuous fighting. The Soviets will call him Cherniy Chort, the Black Devil, and put a bounty of 10,000 rubles on his head. They will assign their best pilots to hunt him, study his tactics, develop specific countermeasures to defeat him. None of it will work. He will become the most successful fighter pilot who ever lived, a legend in his own time, a man whose record will stand for as long as humans fight wars in the sky. This is his story, the story of how a teenage boy from the quiet countryside of Württemberg became the deadliest ace of all time, how he survived a war that killed most of his comrades, and how his greatest battles came not in the skies over Russia, but in the Soviet prison camps where he spent 10 brutal years after the war ended. It is a story of extraordinary skill, incredible luck, and a record that will almost certainly never be broken. Erich Alfred Hartmann was born on April 19, 1922, in Weissach, a small town in the Württemberg region of southwestern Germany. It was a time of turmoil for Germany. The Weimar Republic was struggling with economic chaos, political instability, and the lingering humiliation of defeat in the First World War. But for the Hartmann family, life was relatively comfortable and secure. His father, Alfred Hartmann, was a doctor who had served as a medical officer in the First World War. He was a practical man, devoted to his profession and his family, who instilled in his son the values of discipline, hard work, and perseverance. His mother, Elizabeth, was something altogether more unusual, a pioneering woman who had learned to fly in the 1920s, when female pilots were rare enough to be genuine curiosities, subjects of newspaper articles and public fascination. It was his mother who gave Erich his first taste of flight, who planted the seed that would eventually grow into an all-consuming passion. Elizabeth Hartmann had earned her pilot's license in 1928 and operated a small flying school in the years before the Nazi regime consolidated control over German aviation. Young Erich grew up around aircraft, absorbing the language and culture of flight as naturally as other children absorbed the rules of schoolyard games. He would sit in the cockpits of his mother's training aircraft, hands on the controls, imagining himself soaring through the clouds. He would watch the planes take off and land, studying the way they moved through the air, developing an intuitive understanding of flight that would serve him well in the years to come. By the time he was old enough to understand what flying really meant, he already knew that he wanted to spend his life in the sky. By the time he was 14, he was flying gliders, unpowered aircraft that taught the fundamentals of aerodynamics and control without the complexity and danger of powered flight. Glider training was common in Germany during the 1930s, partly because the Treaty of Versailles had severely restricted German military aviation, making gliders one of the few legal ways to develop pilot skills. The restrictions were intended to prevent Germany from rebuilding its air force, but they had the unintended effect of creating an entire generation of young Germans who were intimately familiar with the principles of flight. Thousands of young Germans learned to fly in gliders during this period, soaring on thermal currents, learning to read the wind and the weather, developing the instincts that would later make them formidable fighter pilots. From their ranks would come the men who would dominate the skies of Europe during the Second World War, pilots whose skills had been honed in the peaceful silence of glider flight before being tested in the violent chaos of aerial combat. Hartmann was a natural from the very beginning. He had excellent eyesight, the kind of vision that could spot an enemy aircraft as a tiny speck on the horizon when other pilots saw nothing but empty sky. He had quick reflexes, the ability to process information and make decisions in fractions of a second. He had good spatial awareness, an instinctive sense of where he was in three-dimensional space and how his aircraft was oriented relative to the ground and to other objects. But most importantly, he had an instinctive feel for flight itself, an ability to sense what an aircraft was doing and what it was about to do, to anticipate its movements and respond before conscious thought was even necessary. This was not something that could be taught. It was a gift, a natural talent that some pilots possessed and others simply did not. Hartmann possessed it in abundance. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1940 at the age of 18, beginning the rigorous training program that would prepare him for combat. Germany was already at war by then. Poland had fallen, France had fallen. The Battle of Britain was raging over the English Channel. But Hartmann was not yet ready to fight. The Luftwaffe believed in thorough training, in taking the time to develop pilots properly rather than rushing them into combat half-prepared. The training was comprehensive and demanding. Basic flight instruction in trainers, aerobatics to develop aircraft handling skills, navigation to ensure pilots could find their way across unfamiliar terrain, gunnery to teach them how to hit targets while flying at high speed, formation flying to prepare them for the coordinated tactics of modern air combat. It took more than 2 years to complete, an enormous investment of time and resources that reflected the Luftwaffe's understanding that well-trained pilots were worth far more than half-trained ones who would simply become easy victims for the enemy. By October 1942, Hartmann had earned his wings and was finally ready for combat. He was assigned to III, JG-52, 3rd Group, 52nd Fighter Wing, one of the most successful fighter units on the Eastern Front. The unit was based in the Caucasus region of southern Russia, supporting German forces that were driving toward the oil fields that Hitler believed would win the war. It was here, in the skies over the vast and bloody Eastern Front, that Erich Hartmann would learn to fight, and very nearly die in the process. The Eastern Front was unlike any other theater of the air war, different in scale and intensity from anything that existed in Western Europe or North Africa or the Pacific. In Western Europe, aerial combat was intense but limited in scale. The Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe dueled over Britain, France, and Germany, but the numbers involved were relatively modest, hundreds of aircraft on each side, fighting for control of a confined and well-defined airspace. The battles were fierce, the losses were significant, but the overall scale was manageable by the standards of modern industrial warfare. In the East, the scale was absolutely staggering, almost beyond comprehension. The Soviet Union had the largest air force in the world, with thousands upon thousands of aircraft and an industrial base that could produce thousands more. The front stretched for more than 1,000 miles, from the frozen Arctic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The fighting was continuous, relentless, and extraordinarily costly for both sides. A war of attrition that consumed men and machines at a rate that would have been unsustainable for any nation with lesser resources. The Germans had started the war on the Eastern Front with a significant advantage in training and tactics. Luftwaffe pilots in 1941 were among the best in the world, products of a rigorous training system that emphasized individual skill and aggressive combat. They had developed innovative tactics during the Spanish Civil War and the early campaigns of World War II. The Finger Four formation that provided mutual support while allowing flexibility, the diving attack that used altitude and speed as weapons, the hit-and-run engagement that maximized the advantages of superior aircraft performance. These tactics would be studied and copied by air forces around the world in the decades to come. In 1941, they gave the Luftwaffe a decisive edge over their Soviet opponents. Soviet pilots in 1941 were, by contrast, often poorly trained and badly led. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had decimated the officer corps of the Red Army and Red Air Force, removing experienced commanders and replacing them with political loyalists who knew little about modern warfare. The purges had created an atmosphere of fear and conformity that stifled initiative and punished independent thinking, exactly the qualities that were most valuable in aerial combat. Soviet aircraft in 1941 were generally inferior to their German counterparts, slower, less maneuverable, less well-armed. Soviet tactics emphasized rigid formations and ground control that limited individual initiative, forcing pilots to follow predetermined plans rather than adapting to the rapidly changing circumstances of aerial combat. The result, in the first year of the war, was a slaughter of almost unimaginable proportions. German pilots shot down Soviet aircraft by the dozen, by the score, accumulating kill counts that would have been unimaginable in any other theater of the war. Some German aces had more than 100 confirmed victories by the end of 1941, totals that Western Allied pilots would never approach, that seemed almost fictional to airmen fighting over Britain or North Africa. But the Soviets learned. They learned because they had to, because the alternative was annihilation, because the vast resources of the Soviet Union gave them the ability to absorb losses that would have destroyed any other air force and come back stronger. They improved their training programs, weeding out the incompetent and promoting the talented. They developed better aircraft, the Yakovlev Yak series, the Lavochkin La-5, planes that could compete with German fighters on equal terms. They adopted German tactics, copying what worked and discarding what didn't. They began producing pilots and planes in quantities that German industry could not hope to match. By 1942, when Hartmann arrived at the front, the air war over Russia was becoming more competitive. Soviet pilots were no longer easy prey for experienced German hunters. They were dangerous opponents who had learned from their earlier defeats, who could kill careless German pilots as easily as they had been killed themselves in the early months of the war. Hartmann's first months in combat reflected this new and more dangerous reality. His initial engagement, the one that ended with his aircraft shot down and his long walk back to German lines, was a harsh and nearly fatal lesson in the consequences of overconfidence. He had underestimated his opponent, attacked recklessly without proper planning or awareness of the tactical situation, and paid the price for his inexperience. But he learned from the experience in a way that many pilots did not. Unlike some young flyers who repeated their mistakes over and over until those mistakes finally killed them, Hartmann had the intelligence and the humility to analyze what had gone wrong and adjust his approach accordingly. He studied the tactics of more experienced pilots in his squadron, particularly his squadron leader Walter Krupinski, who had already accumulated more than 100 kills by the time Hartmann arrived. He watched how Krupinski approached combat, how he positioned himself before engaging, how he selected his targets, how he broke off engagements that were becoming too dangerous. He absorbed these lessons and made them part of his own developing style. He practiced gunnery obsessively, spending hours in training flights learning to hit targets at various ranges and angles. Most pilots opened fire at several hundred meters, hoping that some of their bullets would find the target. Hartmann practiced until he could hit targets at ranges that other pilots couldn't match, until he had the confidence to hold his fire, until he was so close that missing was almost impossible. He developed patience, learning to wait for the perfect shot rather than opening fire at the first opportunity. This patience was perhaps his most important tactical innovation, the quality that most distinguished him from other pilots. He understood that a perfect shot from close range was worth more than a dozen hopeful bursts from long distance, that ammunition was precious and should not be wasted, that the pilot who waited for the right moment would almost always triumph over the pilot who fired too soon. His kill count began to climb steadily as his skills developed. One victory in October 1942, his first confirmed kill, achieved after several unsuccessful engagements. Two victories in November as he began to find his rhythm. 7 victories in December as his confidence grew and his tactics matured. He was no longer a liability to his squadron. He was becoming an asset, a pilot who could be trusted in combat, who would not panic under pressure, who would make good decisions when good decisions meant the difference between life and death. But it was not until 1943 that Hartmann developed the tactical approach that would make him truly legendary, that would elevate him from a skilled pilot to the deadliest ace in the history of aerial warfare. The key insight came from his careful analysis of what separated the most successful pilots from the merely competent ones. Most pilots, Hartmann realized, engaged in traditional dogfighting, the swirling, turning, twisting combat that had characterized aerial warfare since the First World War. They would spot an enemy aircraft close to engagement range and then begin maneuvering for position, trying to get behind their opponent while simultaneously preventing their opponent from getting behind them. These dogfights could last for many minutes, with both aircraft twisting and turning through the sky, each pilot straining against the forces of gravity and acceleration, each one trying desperately to bring his guns to bear on the other. The fights were exhausting, dangerous, and often inconclusive. Both pilots would break off, low on fuel and ammunition, neither having achieved a decisive result. Dogfighting was exciting, even exhilarating for pilots who enjoyed the pure challenge of aerial combat. But Hartmann recognized that it was also deeply inefficient and unnecessarily dangerous. A prolonged engagement gave the enemy time to call for reinforcements, to get lucky with a desperate shot, to exploit any momentary mistake the attacker might make. It consumed precious fuel and ammunition that might be needed for later engagements. It left the pilot physically exhausted and mentally drained, vulnerable to mistakes in the critical moments that followed. And often, far too often, these extended dogfights ended without a kill, both aircraft breaking off to fight another day, neither pilot having accomplished anything meaningful. Hartmann developed a different approach, one that maximized his advantages while minimizing his exposure to risk. He summarized it with a simple phrase that would become his tactical motto: see, decide, attack, break. First, see the enemy before the enemy sees you. This was where Hartmann's exceptional eyesight gave him a crucial advantage that other pilots simply could not match. He could spot Soviet aircraft at distances of several kilometers, when they were nothing more than tiny specks against the sky or the ground, when other pilots would have seen nothing at all. This ability to see first meant that Hartmann almost always had the initiative. He could choose when and how to engage, could position himself optimally before the enemy even knew he was there, could plan his attack while his opponent was still flying along in blissful ignorance. The pilot who sees first almost always wins, and Hartmann almost always saw first. Second, decide on the optimal attack approach. Having spotted his target, Hartmann would not rush in immediately. Instead, he would take time to assess the tactical situation, the position of the enemy aircraft, the presence of any other enemy planes that might interfere, the location of the sun, the altitude advantage or disadvantage, the direction of the wind. He would position himself above and behind the enemy, using altitude and sun position to his advantage, making sure that he had a clear escape route if anything went wrong. He would plan his attack run in advance, visualizing exactly how he would approach, exactly where he would aim, exactly how he would disengage after firing. By the time he actually began his attack, he had already fought the engagement in his mind, had already anticipated the enemy's likely responses, had already prepared for every contingency. Third, attack with absolute commitment and maximum violence. When Hartmann finally decided to engage, he did so with total dedication. He would dive on his target at maximum speed, closing the distance as quickly as possible, using the energy of his dive to build up velocity that the enemy could not match. He would not open fire at long range, as most pilots did. Instead, he would hold his fire until he was extremely close. At that range, he could not miss. Even a short burst of fire, a half-second squeeze of the trigger, would be lethal. The concentration of hits at such close range would destroy any aircraft instantly, would give the enemy pilot no chance to evade or fight back or even understand what was happening to him. Finally, brake immediately after firing. This was perhaps the most important element of Hartmann's tactical system, the discipline that kept him alive when other pilots died. After firing his burst, Hartmann would not stay to observe the results of his attack. He would not circle back to confirm the kill. He would not attempt a second pass if his first one had missed. Instead, he would dive away at maximum speed, using the momentum of his attack to escape before the enemy could react. He would put as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of the engagement, climbing and turning to regain altitude and position, preparing for the next attack. Only after he had put safe distance between himself and any potential threats would he look back to confirm his kill. This discipline, the iron willpower to break off immediately after firing, to resist the natural temptation to stay and watch, saved his life more times than he could count. This approach, sometimes called boom and zoom in later aviation terminology, was not entirely original to Hartmann. Other pilots had used similar tactics, had recognized the advantages of speed and surprise over turning combat. But Hartmann refined the approach to an unprecedented level of perfection, practicing it until it became completely instinctive, applying it with a discipline and consistency that few other pilots could match. The results were extraordinary, almost beyond belief. His kill count accelerated dramatically through 1943 as his tactical system matured. 148 confirmed victories by the end of the year, including multiple days with 4 or 5 separate kills. He was shooting down Soviet aircraft at a rate that seemed almost impossible, that made other pilots shake their heads in amazement and disbelief. He was not just a good pilot anymore. He was becoming something else entirely, a phenomenon, a force of nature, the most lethal fighter pilot anyone had ever seen. His success brought recognition from the German military hierarchy. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, then the German Cross in Gold, then the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the progression of decorations that marked the career of a successful German combat officer. Each medal brought new respect from his comrades, new attention from his superiors, new pressure to continue performing at the extraordinary level he had established. He was promoted from lieutenant to first lieutenant to captain, rising through the ranks with a speed that reflected his exceptional performance in combat. He was given command of his own squadron, entrusted with the training of new pilots, expected to pass on the skills and tactics that had made him so successful. But success also brought danger of a new and more personal kind. The Soviets had noticed him. The Soviet Air Force kept careful track of German aces, identifying them by their aircraft markings, their radio call signs, their characteristic tactics. Intelligence officers compiled dossiers on the most successful German pilots, studying their methods, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited, developing specific countermeasures to defeat them. Hartmann had made himself even easier to identify by painting his aircraft's nose with a distinctive black tulip-shaped design. He had intended the marking to intimidate his opponents, to make them break off and flee rather than engage a pilot with such a fearsome reputation. The psychological warfare seemed like a good idea at the time. Instead, the distinctive marking made him a target for every ambitious Soviet pilot who dreamed of becoming a hero by shooting down the legendary German ace. The Soviets put a bounty on his head, 10,000 rubles for the pilot who shot him down.